Good morning, everyone. Here we are continuing the Ananda way of life from the guidelines for conduct for the members of the Sevaka order. So let us pray and then we'll get into our discussion. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dear friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to feel your guiding presence, that the wisdom of your words be self-evident to us, and that our hearts rise spontaneously and joyously to meet the descending light, expand our awareness, strengthen our determination, purify us of all limiting thoughts and feelings, that we may live in harmony always with your will. Om. Peace. Amen. All right, my friends, we are still, and will be for a little while longer, working with Article 6, which is marriage. As I was explaining yesterday, this is not really about how to be happily married. There's just a few suggestions which I read yesterday and a little bit in this text also. This is mostly about making the decision to marry, finding an appropriate partner, understanding how the relationship between two people fits in the context of commitment to a greater family, balancing the personal with the community. It's a delicate dance that is always a work in progress. Fortunately, it's never reached anything resembling a dogma or a rigid reality, because it simply can't. Swami's wonderfully understanding phrase once was, you can't always control the feelings of the heart. It's just, we can have ideas about this, but there's energy and forces that are just not rational. That doesn't mean they're irrational, it just means that they're not under the control of the mind at all times. He was always very supportive and sympathetic, but nonetheless, the guidelines that are in place here are very helpful. And of course, those of you who don't actually live in community, this is one of the articles of this booklet where living in a residential community, this context is very specific, and therefore there is a general learning to be gained from this, but some of the details are very specific. But let's go on. It says, no two members wishing to get married should feel that the matter is their concern alone. Grave mistakes in marriage might be prevented if the advice of others, spiritual well-wishers especially, uninfluenced by personal desire, were consulted. So I'm taking this opportunity to urge you, no matter where you live or who you are, to try to find people in your life whose impersonal wisdom you can trust. And maybe there are people who are in your own family or close to you for other reasons, or maybe it's just someone you seek out. And it's not a question of their position, it's a question of their actual magnetism and their actual relationship to you. Sometimes it can be just a very good friend whom you know to have a degree of wisdom and to be uninfluenced by their own prejudices, so that they can just really and honestly say to you, this is a good idea, this is a bad idea. Marriage being one of those areas where judgment can get clouded. I know when a friend of mine made a very unfortunate marriage choice, and before she got married, this was 50 years ago almost, I suggested to her that this was really not a good move. And when it proved to be not a good move, she said to me, "Why didn't you warn me?" And I said, "I did." And I told her exactly where we were when we had the conversation. She had absolutely no memory of it. It's just reason follows feeling, and that was that. So these things are very delicate, but not just a question of, oh, now I want to get married, now I have to find someone to ask. It's a relationship that you should cultivate to always have someone that you can go to and ask for an objective, loving response to our own impulses. Because sometimes we're right and sometimes we're wrong. And it's helpful to have someone get us through the maze of our own karma. So it says here, and this is the general policy within the community, if you wish to get married, you ask the opinion of people who know you well and can help guide you spiritually. Spiritual well-wishers, especially uninfluenced by personal desire. The difficulty is that consultation needs to take place before the couple is deeply embroiled. I've been on the receiving end of this so-called consultation on more than one occasion. Two people will come in together with their arms wrapped around each other and sit hip to hip on the couch and say, "What do you think about our relationship?" And there's really not much you can say at that point except, yeah. It's just like, it's not really a question, because somebody's going to get their heart broken already, or people are going to get mad at you because their desires are so engaged. I'm very sympathetic to how these forces take us over. It's just, this is what life is like. But if the relationship is in place, if the individuals can actually objectively consider with the advice of a spiritual well-wisher before the entanglement happens, that's a better time to consider it than after it happens. Because, just as I was saying earlier, in a community, if something becomes disharmonious, we're all friends with each other, and it's hard when there's a break. And I speak from experience in this. If two people to whom I am a friend and loyal to both come in and ask me what do I think about a relationship that's already totally committed and underway, and it happens. It could be good for one and not so good for the other. The other's really fortunate to have such a fine partner, but the partner has now taken on something that maybe wasn't such a good idea for them to take on. It's an impossible situation for even the spiritual well-wisher. So the more detached we are when we ask for advice, the better off we'll be, and life happens. Couples wishing to be married should seek the counsel of a minister or their spiritual director. Members of the Ananda Sevaka order seek to develop true spiritual compatibility in their relationships as opposed to merely romantic attraction. And this is the crux of it. There's another, sentence that relates actually to the quality of the relationship. True spiritual compatibility and not only romantic attraction. This goes back to what I was saying yesterday, which is it's very easy to love someone because most people are essentially lovable. But if you're really going to help each other spiritually, there's many other factors to be considered. I remember there was a man in the community, this again was decades ago, who was and still is, a very fine man, a very serious devotee. And Swamiji was quite impressed with him and felt that he really belonged to our family. And he became romantically involved with this woman who was there, but was living there at the time, but did not have the depth of spiritual potential that the man had. But he became enamored of her, and she rightly realized she had a good deal in him. And Swamiji himself never spoke directly to the young man because let me see how to say this. Swamiji never squandered his advice. If he knew a person was not willing or not able to follow what Swami would suggest to him, Swami usually did not make a suggestion, because Swami always had his eye on the long game. And the long game, spiritually speaking, can cover many incarnations. And the long game, spiritually speaking, for Swami was above all to maintain the relationship, to maintain the friendship, to maintain the trust of the individual involved. And if Swami put out too strong a recommendation, when he knew someone was not going to be able to follow it, that would put the person in an impossible position, and they would have to repudiate Swamiji in order to preserve their sense of self-worth. If Swami told me not to and I went ahead and did it, you have to be a very strong person to be able to just cheerfully and openly defy someone like Swami and not be so embarrassed or ashamed. Most people become embarrassed or ashamed and will either then absent themselves for the rest of the incarnation or will turn on Swami, because if Swami's not wrong, then I'm wrong. And that's a very tricky business. So Swami, in almost all cases, would never put a person in that position. Swami just felt, let them just play out their karma, and as long as we can maintain our friendship, then when the karma finally plays itself out, our friendship will still be intact, and I'll still be able to help them. A very notable example of this was, again, involving a romantic relationship. A man very dear to Swamiji, spiritually speaking, became infatuated with this woman, and the woman was not as serious about the spiritual path as the man was, but he was enamored of her, and he was in, as Swami put it, in a rebellious mood. So he went off and started this whole other project with this woman, and for 10 years, and I witnessed it all. The man kept in touch with Swami because Swami kept in touch with him. And every so often, every few months or so, the man would come back and would talk to Swami about the project he was working on. He would ask for suggestions. Swami would give him suggestions. It went on like this. But the first thing that happened in every one of those meetings, and I was very attuned to this, was that Swami would sort of feel it out and see where the man was. And he was always enthusiastic about his relationship, enthusiastic about his project. Swami would probe it very delicately. When he saw where the man was, Swami would become enthusiastic about the relationship, enthusiastic about the project. And that went on for a decade, literally. And the project fizzled, and the relationship became less attractive, and it just kind of ran its course. And finally the man said to Swami when they started the conversation, I've been thinking about coming back to Ananda. Swami just so sweetly, without a hint, said, oh, I think that would be a lovely idea. And that was that. But you see, it could have gone very differently. And then the man came back into the community, found a more suitable partner, everything played itself out in a very positive way, but it could have ended very differently. And going back to this other young man, Swamiji never himself said, don't marry her. But he sent others of us to suggest that perhaps he might reconsider. But never was Swami's authority. Swami did not send any of us to say, Swami says, like that. He just said, see if he's open to another path. And he wasn't. So off he went. Fathered numerous children, had some corporate career, and 45 years later, I ran into him. In fact, he came back once. He stood in front of me and said, "Do you know who I am?" I said, "You look very familiar to me, but I can't remember." So he told me his name, and I remembered the whole thing at that moment. "What have you done all these years?" "Oh, the children, the corporation, the this, the that." "Oh, how nice. How glad. I'm so glad for you." What can I say? Well, you finished another incarnation, but you could see it in his eyes. That's a long story. And karma is karma. We have to act it out. No time is ever wasted if it teaches us to grow closer to God. And these karmas have to be played out. And we have to learn. And it's not like having a corporate job and raising children is a sin. We have to always do our best. And part of doing our best is, there's an odd thing. I've had this happen so many times. Something is very clear because I'm impersonal about it. And the implications are clear, and I'll suggest to someone maybe, sometimes I'm even acting on Swami's insight, but I wouldn't say that unless he'd asked me to say it. And they'll say, "Well, I'll meditate on it." Or, "Well, I have to feel it from inside." Or, let me phrase it differently. That's not the right words. This is what I'm really trying to say. If God can speak to me directly about my life, he might also be able to speak to you directly about my life. It's like inspiration from God, often the person most directly involved, it's the hardest for them to hear it because there's all this other personal energy involved, desires and so on. Like the Swami himself would often ask his friends it wasn't so much that he was unable to feel guidance directly, but this is how he put it on several occasions, which were quite remarkable, where he appeared to be turning very important decisions over to his friends. And in one such case where he just seemed to be giving so much authority to this little group of friends, later someone said to him, "That seemed like a very important decision to let us decide." Oh, Swami said, "Oh no, I was pretty sure what I should do." He said, "But I wanted to see if any of you could think of something I hadn't thought of." And that sort of is how I realized Swami used us. It wasn't like he was a blank slate, tell me what to do, and nor should you go to a spiritual counselor as a blank slate, tell me what to do. But this is how I'm seeing it. Tell me, what am I missing? What am I missing here? And that's how Swami said it. He wanted to know if any of us could think of something that he hadn't considered. And he listened attentively. He didn't cut us off saying, "Oh yeah, I thought of that. Oh yeah, that's not true." He really listened. "Do you have a message for me?" Because God can speak through anyone. Sometimes from the babe or the fool, God speaks more clearly. But we're not passive in our receptivity. And on many occasions, I personally have brought, in fact, that was the way he trained me fundamentally, was I would express myself and he would expand and correct me. Yes, of course, I sat and listened to Swami a great deal. I was quieter as the years passed. The early years I was a bigger noise, because I realized over time that on occasion I blocked Swami's comments because of what I said. And as I became more aware of that, I listened. But I never listened passively. But especially at the beginning, I told him everything. I told him what I was thinking, and as I gained more courage, I told him what I was doing. But I was interested in finding out what was true. I wasn't interested in persuading him that I was right. But I really wanted to know what was true. But this is what I'm thinking. Is this correct? And what Swami taught me is how to think. And how to think, how to find your way to a solution is more accurate. I say how to think because the wisdom aspect of the spiritual path is something that that I'm in tune with, and that helps me. It helps me to come to right decisions, to have the principles very clear. And because, of course, I have to do all this talking and explaining, Swami cooperated a great deal with teaching me mental clarity. But it was also, what am I missing? What am I missing? What am I missing? The present time I'm involved in a very complicated situation that involves a lot of my Guru Bhais. And we have very different, there's a wide range of opinions, and we're in a conflict in certain areas that has not yet come to a harmonious resolution. And as much as I am able, I find people who don't necessarily agree with me. What am I missing? Tell me what I'm missing. Don't just tell me why I'm right. This is how it looks to me. What am I missing? That's always the question. This is what I know so far. Am I missing anything? What am I missing? What have I put together in the wrong way? By no means am I perfect about it. Not too long ago, some friends of mine said something. I think they actually said, well, you wouldn't listen anyway. I only later heard it even. You wouldn't listen anyway. Whoa, that's not very good. So I've gone back and tried to work my way through that. But the fact is, I didn't want to listen. They were telling the truth. But the resistance was very deep. And so it wasn't just a question of saying, oh, yes, I am, yes, I am. Because I remember Swamiji came back from some friends took him to Hawaii, took him on a holiday to Hawaii. This was many years ago. And anyway, he was there. And when he came back, let's see, Seva and I picked him up from the airport. So this would have been in the 70s. And we were in the car. This is a very odd story, but we were in the car with Swami. And he just started ragging on us. I can't remember the details or even how, but just pretty much everything Seva said or everything I said, Swami just contradicted us and gave us another answer. And it was, just like he just wouldn't let anything we said stand on its own. But the more he did that, the more humorous it seemed. I mean, and I was pretty sensitive, so it wasn't like he could thwart me without my having a reaction to it. But the more he went after us, the more amused we became. Until Seva and I were just laughing. It was so crazy. And then Swami this went for maybe 10 minutes. And then Swami himself just exhaled this long exhalation. And he said that the company he'd been in for the 10 days or so that he'd been away had been very, very difficult. He said that one or two of the people there said, I want to be corrected, I want to learn, correct me if I'm wrong in anything. But Swami said they weren't receptive to a single thing he said. No matter what they said, they really wanted nothing from him. And basically, he just sort of built up this frustration to correct ignorance around him because he couldn't be of any help to these people. He just sort of, and he exhaled and he said, I just had to get that out of my system, is what he said. And then we all laughed, but it was just, what you say with your words is not always what you really mean with your heart. So we have to work on this. And of course, this is the Olympic trials of being open to guidance, is when one has given one's heart and is completely attached and has planned one's life, and then you go to your spiritual advisor and say, oh, by the way, anything you say, I'll do whatever you say. Yeah, right. So we have to cultivate this long before. And it's helpful. It's very helpful. Now, I mentioned at the beginning, and I'll say this for Swami too, he very rarely interferes in people's personal lives. And he only gives advice where it's really welcome. Now I have to tell you one other silly story while I'm thinking about this. I wrote this up in my book about Swami Kriyananda. Jyotish and Devi got married in 1974, 1975, very early, at a time when many people were monastic, but their destiny was to be householders. And we'd all been friends for a long time, and I believe Devi knew the first time she saw Jyotish that he was her husband, but it took him a little longer to figure it out. And so when he finally figured it out, they became engaged and were married very quickly because the relationship was already established. Now, there had been a subplot that had been going on in the little circle of people that was with Swamiji, which was whether or not you put milk in your coffee and your tea, or whether you took it black. Jyotish was steadfastly against having milk in his coffee and his tea. Swami and I were steadfastly in favor of having milk and cream always. And it was, in Swamiji's way, it became an enormous question that went on continuously as to who was right and who was wrong. I remember one occasion in which, for some reason, there was no milk in the house. And when we had tea in the afternoon, we all had to drink it without milk. And Swami and I were there, and Jyotish was there feeling quite puffed up, having imposed upon all of us his preference. Swami and I were drinking the tea. It was actually really good without the milk. And both of us sort of noticed that at the same time. Tea without milk is quite good. And we sort of looked at each other and whispered, but under no circumstances, even if they torture us, will we ever admit this to Jyotish? All just terribly exaggerated. So shortly after Jyotish and Devi became engaged, but before they were married, I was with Swami in the house. Seva was there probably, but Devi was absent. And we were sitting down to tea. And sometimes Swami had this way when he had something on his mind and he didn't really know how to say it. I mean, this was seriously, how he would do it. He would be somewhat withdrawn. And often you would see him sort of staring sort of slightly off to the side, looking at the floor. Sometimes he would even fold his arms and kind of lean back. And you knew that he was trying to figure something out that he was then going to say to you. So we were sort of quiet, letting him be there. And then he looks right at Jyotish, just looks him right in the eye and says, "I don't think this marriage with Devi is ever going to work out." And you just saw Jyotish, just all the blood drains out of his face, and he just looks absolutely stricken. And then Swami says, "Because you're never going to be able to say to her." And then he starts singing this popular song from the 20s. See, "You're the cream in my coffee, you're the milk in my tea," like this. "You're my everything, I can't live without you." You're just never going to be able to say that to her. we laughed. We could hardly stop laughing. Then Swami sang the whole song. It's a whole pop song that he must have known when he was a teenager, just about all the different ways. But oh my, what a moment. Now, how I ever got onto that, I don't know, but that's the end for today. God bless you.